and we are back on the Zero Hour. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and our next guest is the leader of a group I almost joined because a friend of mine, I'll give a shout out to a great bass player, Dan Schwartz, is a member of this group, invited me to join a demonstration outside the Grammys. I couldn't do it. I was out of town, but the group is the Content Creators Coalition. It can be found at c3action.org, sometimes also known as C3. The general counsel and executive director of that group is Jeffrey Boxer, and he joins us now. Jeffrey, thanks for coming on the program.
Thank you for having me.
So tell us just briefly, what is C3, Content Creators Coalition? What are you guys trying to do?
Well, thank you. First of all, thank you for having me on again. And what we are is an organization of creators, people that make their living often through their creative endeavors, and principally musicians right now, but not just. And are the increasing awareness of inequities, inequalities that have been created through digital distribution, and in many cases just the outright taking of the creator's work and repurposing it in order to sell advertisements or just sell it, period, for subscription services, either not paying the creators at all or paying them in extremely inadequate ways.
Okay, and this is a huge issue. This is one I personally haven't written about in a while. I was writing about it maybe 8, 9, 10 years ago. And back then, you got a lot of people saying, well, information wants to be free, and basically your songs or your creative output is information, and therefore it wants to be free. So it was almost characterized as, anarchy and freedom versus the greediness of the musician. I think what we're seeing now is, and I was on felt like a lone voice sometimes those days. I think what we're seeing now is it's really about the rights of people who work in the creative world to be compensated for their efforts versus powerful corporations who are exploiting them and taking their work for free and making money off it. Is that a fair interpretation?
I think that's spot on. What we're, boy, how have things changed. Over the last 10 years, what went from being the cool kids and information wants to be free, which, as the aforementioned Dan Schwartz already points out, that's not really the full quote, but all of us quote it that way, so we might as well treat it, that's how the public treats it. But the obligation now is to whether or not people that make these, great works and this great art can, possibly sustain, a living in that area. Most of us either are employees, we get paid for our time, or we make stuff and we get paid for selling it. And we've seen, tremendous upheaval in the getting paid for your time employment sector, and now we've seen, conjointly with that, the same kind of upheaval in people getting paid for selling their work and being performers and songwriters and creators. And this is not a sustainable situation. People are leaving these industries, and it's become, in many instances, extremely desperate. There's one performer who prefers not to be known for this, who I interviewed for our organization and asked him to join. And literally, there's someone who has 6 or 7 albums out, and as I'm talking to him, he's filling out an Uber application. And incredibly talented musician. Much praise. And, in order to make ends meet, he has to, basically go drive part-time. There's no dishonor in driving. That's not what I'm saying. The point being,
not.
Of course not. The misallocation of resources, the broken sorting mechanism in our society where people used to be able to try things, and if they were good at it, they could just try to promote up in it or open a company or, do whatever, go to graduate school, pursue it, and to now where, we're not really creating opportunities for people to be able to try what they're good at that may not have huge economic return. And then on the other side of it, the people that are running all of these companies don't have any real experience in the world of work or creation. And so there's a lack of empathy that goes along with it as well. It's a huge problem, culturally, socially, and economically. And the displacement... Yes.
Your story, we're talking with Jeffrey Boxer, Executive Director of the Content Creators Coalition, or C3. Your story about the guy who's made great albums and is now an Uber driver just kind of crystallizes a shift in power that we actually talk a lot about in this show toward the concentration of wealth in Silicon Valley digital type companies like Uber, for that matter, or Spotify and Pandora. And on the one hand, and then the conversion of people who used to be able to make a decent living into hand-to-mouth piece workers, whether it is in Uber or somewhere. I mean, I can tell you, my own story that I was a musician and performer and songwriter, and I had a few things out. And many years ago, I would never do it again. I'm in another phase of my life. I still write songs. I don't even bother with them anymore, or write as many as I might, because the fact is that I know, or I feel, I can't get paid for them. But how do we address that sense? And by the way, it's true. Information wants to be free is only half the quote, but it's the one that people use. So it's taken on a life of its own. How do we communicate to people who say, well, but it's great to be able to stream free music?
Of course it is. This is not about technology. That's the funny thing. And when people talk about it, they tend to get very bundled up in that. And I think I know where you're going with this. Thank you for asking that question, because this is about business models. Whether or not you have the ability to transmit something a certain way has nothing to do with how you pay people. And those are two totally different things. And the idea, the fact that these business models, in many cases, when we're talking about, YouTube Media Key, when we're talking about Spotify, when we're talking about Pandora, when we're talking about paying, incredibly substandard rates, to the creators, it's not that everybody's getting a substandard rate. There's people that are making money off of these things. So it's not to people, to the end user, to the fan, to the loyalist. We're not talking about you. We're talking about something that affects you. We're talking about something that impacts you. We're talking about something that's incredibly important to you, but we're not castigating you for wanting to be able to stream. Artists, my organization, people outside of my organization, artists want their work to be heard, or seen, or whatever it is. They want an audience. So it's not that. It's the question is, where's the money going? And how's that being done? So if your business model is premised, almost entirely upon not having to pay the creator, then there's a problem with the business model. It's not a problem with the person that's listening to the music. So I hope no one takes it as criticism if they're using these things. We all like the technology. We're all quite techy, and we frankly should be. There's great stuff in it. What's not okay with it is that we bundle that into a business model that somehow or other is inevitable because of these technologies. They're not.
And I think we're talking with Jeffrey Boxer, Executive Director of Content Creators Coalition. Yes, that is exactly where I was going. And there's another point I want to make, which I want to get your thoughts on, which is, when I was waging these battles, I remember a guy wrote to me and he said, "Oh, you're crazy. I make a good living as a musician. I tour all the time. I get paid well." So I wrote him back and I said, "Well, what kind of band are you in?" And he said, "Led Zeppelin cover band." And right, where I'm going now, which is, and he didn't even realize, look, people who know the history of Led Zeppelin, for example, know that Jimmy Page was making a great living as a studio musician. There would have been no Led Zeppelin if the business model of today was in place in 1968. So I guess my point is, do you agree with my premise, which is that I think the end user needs to understand they're going to miss out on a lot of great music if this model doesn't change? Do you agree with that premise? And if so, how do we communicate that and wage that battle?
Well, interesting, because you and I have actually not spoken about this before, and people are going to think we're all in the amen corner here, but that's exactly the point that we're making, is that people are leaving. If you go to the Bureau of Labor Statistics and you can pull out the the statistics on how many people are musicians, how many are paid musicians, how many are actually following this as a career, we're watching the numbers drop. And that, and yes, there's hobbyists and the rest of it, but that's not really the same thing. I mean, so much of art is virtuosity and the individual pursuit and small group pursuit of this kind of greatness. If we don't make that a priority, if we don't recognize the legitimacy of that, we're going to have huge problems. But even more than that, I mean, that could be just as true about the nonprofit realm, where there's so much art that's paid for, that's never going to make any money. What we're talking about here is things that were, and for other people besides the creators, still are commercially viable, and they're just not being allowed to benefit from the value of their work. It's literally being taken out from under them. And that, I don't care where you are on the political spectrum. This is supposed to be, the foundation of this marketplace, regardless of how you feel about it, which is if you create something, you should be able to sell it and, and get a fair return on it. That's what we're not seeing. We're not saying, for people whose, music nobody wants, that they deserve a living or anybody or anything along those lines. The bottom line is these are people who are successful in terms of people that wanting to hear them by any measure and are denied the ability to make a basic living from it. That's crazy. I mean, that really is when what could possibly be left at that point of the argument. It's like we're not talking about people that are somehow or other dependent upon the government, although I found that argument abhorrent. We're not talking about people that are being guaranteed a living. They're making a living. They have an audience. They have a huge audience. People want to hear it. They like it. And what they don't realize is the very same people that are doing this stuff are being creamed. And for absolutely no, there's certainly no intent on the fans' part for that to happen. They don't care who has the money.
And I think that's absolutely right. And you got to hand it to the corporations for somehow making this even a debate, whether people should be compensated for the work they do. But I'm glad you guys are out there. Jeffrey Boxer, thanks for joining us, Executive Director and General Counsel of the Content Creators Coalition. Where can you guys be found online?
Well, we're at www.c3action.org, and we welcome everyone, especially you.
Well, thank you so much, and thanks for coming on the show. We will be right back after this. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and this is The Zero Hour.